I was reading the three concepts for this year's Bathhouse reading: dissent, resistance, and autonomy. I had, as so often, a negative reaction, because it seems that certain concepts that within the Russian space and maybe within the larger Eastern European space mark a horizon of political possibility and hope have a very different connotation in the West. I mean, they sound like, when I hear dissent, when I hear resistance above all, when I hear autonomy, it reminds me of a kind of self-indulgent and self-congratulatory academic discourse at Berkeley and Stanford. I mean, I hope I can include Berkeley. I give you an example. One of my best undergraduate students is a young woman, Yura is her first name, out of South Korea. And she's working on an honors thesis. An honors thesis is the work you write at the end of your 4 years of college about a very interesting phenomenon in Japanese culture. I mean, she's Korean, works on Japanese culture. And this is about a tradition starting in the 18th century in Japan about a joint suicide of two women who are engaged in an erotic relationship. It's a joint suicide, but it is the expression of ecstatic love. And from the 18th century on, it has also been a literary tradition. Now, this young woman recently had to do an exam for a final grade from Stanford for a graduation with a colleague of mine. And the colleague of mine was saying, why don't you use the word subversive and the word of resistance for that, for this collective suicide? And she said, because it's not subversive. It is not resistance. It is the expression of ecstatic love, nothing else. And she got a B-. And I mean, those who know American universities, a B- as your final grade is absolutely horrible. She got a B- because she did not want to engage in resistance and in subversiveness, because she had a phenomenon that was not a political phenomenon. It is even worse existentially, because this work in her existential case is connected to a coming out. So this is a moment when she is now openly, she doesn't like the word lesbian, but she shows herself hand in hand with her girlfriend, and she felt that was also graded. This was also B-, so to speak. She was not allowed to be what she wanted to be. So this is an example that shows you what my connotation would be with dissent, with resistance, with autonomy. So what I will do in the next 20 minutes is to try and rethink critically these concepts. And the first round was, I wanted to relate these concepts to the state, to statehood. Because, I mean, the state has been the bad instance, the bad institutions in our discussion. You are against the state, you resist the state, you dissent from the state, you create an autonomous space within the state. And if you think about dissent, you would say that under American conditions, it is actually the legal system and the state which through the First Amendment and the Second Amendment secure the absolute possibility of individual dissent. You can dissent in any way. There's nothing you cannot say individually. And if you articulate it collectively, then it becomes internal politics. So it can be against the state, but the state has a right to fight back. Yeah? Or secondly, if you think about resistance, resistance is an individual right, but resistance has limits. Yeah? I mean, the resistance cannot go so far to not pay taxes. If you don't pay taxes, you are in trouble, and I think that's right, that you're in trouble if you don't pay taxes. Or, for example, there are certain juridical decisions that are final, and if you don't follow these decisions, it's contempt of court, and you're in trouble. You can go to jail. And I wanted to say I'm completely okay with that. I'm not against that. And thirdly and finally, there are certain demands when there is an autonomous space emerging in a society for a certain degree of transparency. You cannot completely close it up. If you have a society within a society, you have to be open about it. And also there's a certain moment when this autonomy within the state has to be the autonomy of a different state. I mean, this would be in Europe, the present situation of Catalonia. Yeah? You cannot have a state within the Spanish state at some point to say, okay, the consequence would be independence under different conditions. So I was starting with that to have a certain accent of sobriety on our charismatic concepts, because the charismatic concepts of this Banyi colloquium is dissent, resistance, autonomy. There are certain limits to dissent, resistance, autonomy, and I wanted to now, and this is the main part of what I want to think about, to relate dissent, resistance, autonomy to the potential of literature. What are the possibilities of literature if you go about dissent, resistance, autonomy? I mean, normally there is a prefabricated answer, and this is an answer from the 1950s, and that is Jean-Paul Sartre and littérature engagée. You use literature for political purposes, and the more you use literature for political purposes, the better literature gets. Now, I want to strengthen here, in association with literature, the concept of imagination that I've also already been using in the discussion of Kevin Platt. Imagination. So when I say literary text, I refer to a text that has a specific capacity to trigger imagination. But what do I mean when I say imagination? I mean two things. I mean an intentional object, I mean this is Husserl, I mean a content of consciousness that has not yet gone through the filter of concepts. Yeah? It is an image on your mind that is not yet circumscribed, that does not have a meaning, that has a certain energy, that has a certain movement, that can inspire things, but you do not know in what direction it is going. Precisely if you do not have a context, if you do not have a pragmatic goal or political goal, then the imagination on your mind can continue to be imagination. It can have this energy. And secondly, as you all know from your erotic daydreams, and I hope everybody here has erotic daydreams, I mean, you look like that. I mean, imagination, different from concepts, has an immediate impact on our body. Yeah? I mean, imagination produces body reactions, erotic body reactions, for example, but also if you read certain passages in Proust about food, can all of a sudden get hungry. And in that sense, imagination also has the capacity to create what I call mystical bodies, groups that are not unified because they have the same idea. That would be a group that has solidarity, for example. That would be a political party. But people who are joined by having something similar on their mind and by being united, physically united, through this energy. So if you associate that with literature, imagination in that sense, and if you then combine literature with dissent, with resistance, with autonomy, you all of a sudden realize that this is a problematic relationship, a complicated relationship. And you also realize, I just wanted to allude, that this is probably a thematic horizon that could get you into this very, very interesting dimension we were talking about yesterday, and that would be the historicity of emotions. I mean, under which conditions certain emotions, different emotions, historically specific emotions, can emerge. And I wanted to very briefly go through 4 historical examples to have the basis of formulating at the end a couple of theses about this relationship between dissent, resistance, autonomy on the one hand, and imagination on the other hand. My first example, very briefly, will be the very famous 1898 protest of Émile Zola in the Dreyfus affair. And then with the second example, I go way back in the 11th century, and we'll talk briefly about the emergence of what we call medieval love poetry, troubadour poetry. I will then go into the 18th century, and then we'll then briefly talk, but it's all very briefly, these are just like one-slide projections, about literature in Central and Western Europe today, imagination in Central and Western Europe today. First example, and I associate this example with dissent. This would be Émile Zola in 1898. This was Zola's intervention in the anti-Semitic conspiracy between the French state, the French military, and the French Catholic Church to protect a case of treason of a French officer by sacrificing a Jewish French officer, Alfred Dreyfus. Yeah, and that case was almost consolidated when all of a sudden, one morning in 1898, Zola launched, in what was then the most popular daily newspaper in France, L'Aurore, his very famous manifesto, J'accuse. He published it there, and he gave the impulse. This was dissent. He dissented with which was the majority opinion in France. 80-90% would all agree that Dreyfus had rightly been sent to the islands of the devil. That was the exile where he had to stay, the prison where he had to stay. And all of a sudden, the whole case was revised, and there was a turnaround, and at the end, Dreyfus was liberated. Now, there are three aspects that interest me here. This is normally quoted as a very famous case for littérature engagée. But it was actually not littérature engagée. The manifesto is a completely political text. What Zola did was to invest a prestige that he had accumulated as a literary author for that case. Yeah? So you have a separation between the text that is a political text that was not supposed to produce imagination, but he used his prestige to have a certain effect. In the second place, and this is very important, the French legal system was strong enough to guarantee the right to dissent for Zola. Yeah? This would not have happened without the legal system. And interestingly, and this was not Zola's will, although Zola had no intention to become a politician, he wanted to continue being a literary author, this was also the end of his career as a literary author. He became officially now the victim of the French state, and when he died 3 years later of a carbon monoxide poisoning, which was relatively, something that happened frequently in the early 20th century, everybody was convinced that he had been the victim of the French state. He most likely was not, but you get my point. Zola died, and he was no longer famous as a literary author. He got into a different system of coordinates, which was the political system. Yeah? It means that if you use your prestige as a literary author within that different network of coordinates, then all of a sudden you are no longer a literary author. Okay, first example. Second example, the probable origin of troubadour poetry. You've all heard about troubadour poetry. I know it's not part of Russian literature, but you know it from French literature and so forth and so forth. Now, it is interesting that in the linguistically oldest troubadour songs that go back to the 11th century, in the songbooks, these songs are always associated with one character, and this was William IX of Aquitaine. Now, we do not know whether he wrote those songs, whether he ever sang them, or whether he was just sponsoring them, but the name is associated. And William IX of Aquitaine is a character in the Latin historiography of the Middle Ages. And it's the following character. He's somebody who, during his lifetime, got excommunicated 7 times by the Pope. He always came back to the church, but he was excommunicated 7 times. It becomes also clear that he was a very, very bad politician. His territorial holdings when he died was 1/3 of his territorial holdings when he was born. So he was clearly a very unsuccessful politician. But he was famous to show his erotic life in public. There was a very famous episode that one Easter morning, he wanted to go to the high mass, and he wanted to go with his lover and not with his wife. And then the bishop said, you cannot come there with your lover. And he said, how can I not go to church with her who carries me in her bed? So this was William IX with Aquitaine. There was then, in this troubadour poetry, a symmetrical negation of what were the church-imposed conditions for love. What is the love in these songs? It is love that cannot happen in marriage. It is, secondly, love that has to happen with a married woman. It cannot happen in marriage. It has to happen with a married woman in a society where there was no divorce. It was, thirdly, love that could only happen between people who would live far away from each other. You see, this is a very extreme imagination. And it was, in the fourth place, love that had to be erotic, but was not supposed to be consummated. So you see, in this situation, you have a symmetrical negation of what was love normally. This is as wild in imagination as possible. Remarks? What I find interesting here is that William IX of Aquitaine is associated with these songs and with this vision of love because he is the opposite of the church. There is a power, a central power, and you protest against the central power, but you have no possibility of politics. You cannot negotiate anything. You just articulate something that is the absolute opposite. You can not negotiate, you can protest, but there is no political system. And I find this interesting because it is an extreme case of imagination, and at the same time, it lasts. And in the Romanticism, it is revived and becomes actually, during the 19th century, absurdly, a blueprint, an idea of what love should really be. I mean, until the present day, this idea of love, this absurd idea of love that comes out of the 11th century has survived. Third example, 18th century, the literature of Enlightenment, as we call it. Now, you have once again, like the church in the 11th century, an absolute opponent. You have, in what we call absolutism coming out of the 17th century, an alliance between the state, between the royal state and the church that is absolutely powerful, and there's absolutely no participation. This is the situation in which, as a protest, an autonomy emerges within society, and this autonomy is precisely what we call, in the 18th century, the public space. Yeah? This means that people, as you were talking about yesterday, people meet, and they try to be completely disconnected from their everyday roles. They try to be purely humane. They try to have interests that are only human interests. And in this context, the public space begins to unfold political claims. The first famous case is 1763, and this is Voltaire, and the case of Jean Calas. Jean Calas was a Protestant in Toulouse, and he had been accused to have prevented his son to convert to Catholicism, and under this accusation, he had been executed. Now, Voltaire identified with this case. Voltaire made him the victim, the great national victim. Voltaire staged himself as the national victim. So there was a protest, but the protest meant that Voltaire got caught in ethics, And I would say these cases, and this is what you feel in 18th century literature, these are cases where imagination cannot float freely, where imagination will always be caught and conceptualized within a political system. You get my point? The basic thesis where I'm going is as soon as you use what you call literature in a political context, in an ethical context, you reduce the power, you reduce the imprevisibility of imagination. And finally, if you look at the European situation today, Western European situation, I think these societies are in a transformation from being fields of contingency to be a universe of contingency. I mean, when I say a society is a field of contingency, that's the classical liberal society, where most cases can be discussed from different sides. So everything becomes an object of discussion. And when it was a field of contingency, I would say, between certain things that were considered to be fate or necessary on the one side, and on the other side, things that were considered to be impossible. When I'm saying that there is a transformation today from a field of contingency to a universe of contingency, I'm referring to situations where you say, well, the sex into which you were born used to be considered fate. Today there is hope that you can change that. So it is no longer fate, there is no longer necessity, for example. And on the other side, certain things seem to be absolutely impossible, like eternal life. Eternal life would be impossible. Now, you know that eternal life today, we will probably never achieve it, but has become, so to speak, a research project for the medical schools. So I think we are in a situation where, different from the medieval situation, different from the 18th century situation, absolutely everything is possible. There is no central power of resistance. And I feel at the same time, and it is a strong statement, this is a situation of crisis in Central and Western European literatures. So it feels you need this resistance against which you can activate your imagination. And this, as Irina is concerned about time, brings me to my final 4 theses, and this is what I would call the dialectics of repression, precisely. The dialectics of repression in the relationship between literature on the one side and these spaces of dissent, of resistance and autonomy on the other side. Can we say, that would be the first thesis, that limitations of thought, prohibitions of thought seem to be a fruitful situation for the triggering of imagination? You need a point of reference of resistance to get your imagination going. Can we say, secondly, that such a situation produces emotions of exuberance, emotions of provocation, like the medieval troubadour poetry? The opposite of what is the institutional case is what you imagine when there is no possibility of political negotiation. At that, from the moment on, where you squeeze this imagination that has been activated in situations of dissent, of resistance, of autonomy, you dry out the imagination. You dry out the energy that this imagination has. You transform it into political claims. Should one therefore perhaps say, in the third place, that littérature engagée, politically committed literature, should be precisely the solar case? Literary authors investing their prestige for political causes, but would it not be better for them to separate the power of imagination from their political engagement? And this leads me finally to an anti-Benjamin position. I mean, in America, where everything is statistified, people have found out that the most frequently quoted essay ever published in the humanities and arts is Walter Benjamin's essay on the artwork. Now, this essay famously ends with a condemnation of an aestheticization of politics. I'm absolutely in agreement with that. And it ends with a recommendation of a politicization of aesthetics. And I'm asking myself whether this is not a problematic recommendation. Should we really have a politicization of aesthetics? Would it not be better, and I felt such a proposal or such a vibe in the presentation of Kevin Platt, would it not be better to leave aesthetics, to leave imagination outside politics? Then it could be what we have been discussing in the discussion before the lunch break. It could be unsettling. It could be something different. You can be something different. You can be something different if you let your imagination go. The price is you do not know where it goes politically. But you can be unsettling. You can be, you were using the word ontology, you can be ontologically something different if you follow your imagination. The price, once again, is that you do not have a political expression, you do not have a political direction where to go. I know that many of you will not like where I'm arriving, but I'm asking myself whether making imagination political will not always be paid by the price of drying out what is the specific possibility of literature, and that is the energy of imagination and the possibility of becoming a unity that is not only like a party shared, based on shared ideas, but that is the unity of a mystical body. The unity like these people with the demonstrations that are together and that are together in a physical way without exactly us knowing where they are going. But I think this is the greater, the more exciting, the more promising potential for the future although we do not know exactly what the content of this promise will be. But I think it is worth doing the risk. Thank you.
I'd like to go back to the beginning of your talk, to the notion of imagination that you propose. And it strikes me, so if we think about it as something that actually, before conceptualization, having to do with emotions and states of bodily states, etc., it actually strikes me as quite similar to what, for example, in anthropology we mean by affect, or not just in anthropology. So,
sure.
So then my question is really, what's the difference between affect and imagination? Like whether you need to say, you know, what you're talking about is could be very much described through the, I don't know, the kind of notions of affect, including political affects, which are simultaneously political and non-political, etc., etc. So my question about the why do you need to redefine the imagination in this way and keep the word imagination?
Well, because I am officially a literary critic or literary theorist, coming from literature, and I'm asking myself, what is the specific effect of the situation we call fiction? You know, the situation we call fiction is normally, willing suspension of disbelief. That means you establish precisely aesthetic autonomy. So you circulate a text without saying this text has to fulfill function X, Y, Z. And precisely that would be what Kant precisely means by disinterestedness. You know, this is aesthetic autonomy. And if texts circulate under this premise, then you as a reader are not bound to read the text according to the intentions of the author. You are free to let this text trigger your imagination. And this is why precisely we always associate, everybody knows that literary texts have a stronger impact on your affects, on your emotions, than pragmatic texts. And my argument would be, if you reintegrate literary text deliberately, strategically, this is Sartre in 1951, and I greatly admire Sartre, it's not against Sartre, but if you get them back into a political context, then the price you have to pay is precisely the cutting short, the drying out of this power of affects and imagination. What you gain is, the effect is predictable, but what you lose is precisely this possibility of triggering what I call mystical bodies, of triggering emotions and so forth, of triggering unsettling effects.
I am struck by the strong normative character of it, in the sense of we should produce art like this. And what is not very clear for me is what is the criteria upon which we are calling certain forms of art dry, political art. On the one hand, because it's maybe a problem of perspective, as we saw in relation to the demonstration. And it also because it reduces art or literature to maybe one dimension. For instance, to give an example, Diamel El Tit, a Chilean writer, produced writing very avant-garde literature under the Pinochet dictatorship. Very difficult to read, very political, but also very aesthetic and very erotic. So I don't see these categories as so tightly antagonistic. So I don't know if you could comment on this.
Normative, professors always talk normatively, especially after 45 years in the profession. Forgive me that. Maybe, in 40 years you talk in a similar way. Of course, it's not like any author would care of what I have to say and would stop writing the way it's writing. What I'm doing is, the argument I try to do is to make an argument for aesthetic autonomy for political reasons. That would be the paradox. I would say that ultimately, the specific political effect, the unsettling effect, the effect of being able to imagine something that nobody has imagined before, the effect not only to say we have a better government. This is what I found so interesting about the discussion before the lunch break. What these demonstrations made me think is there is a desire for a completely different way of living together. And I think this possibility, I'm not saying it's black and white, but this possibility you reduce to the extent that you feel you have to express, you have to articulate, you have to write the allegory of a certain political position. That's what I meant. I mean, so it is ultimately, if you want to, I mean, depends on the concept of politics, it is an argument in favor, rather an argument than a normative recommendation, in favor of aesthetic autonomy, because I think this is how the potential, not only of literature, of painting, of architecture, etc., unfolds in a more powerful way, although a way that you cannot control. You have to give up the control over it.
Thanks, Sepp. Such a great paper in the way also,
Not great file cards.
Well, I love the file cards, but also I think a really wonderful intervention into our discussions here that has sort of grabbed hold of many of the threads that we have been throwing around the last day and a half. So I wanted to say, I mean, I think I'm glad that you came back around to this saying reinvigoration, right? There's a reinvigoration, I think, of both the aesthetic and the political, which is hovering around your intervention. I think part of the problem that we're grappling with here is almost an entirely scholastic problem around the definition of like the political or the aesthetic, and I think we want to come out in different places in this discussion by allowing a little bit more leeway on both sides of the equation, which is where I think Rancière is useful. But I don't want to talk about Rancière now. I was thinking in terms actually of temporalities and politics. It seems like your conception of politics is extraordinarily also normative, in that you're sort of reducing politics to something which is relating to certain kinds of formal rationalities and systems, which articulate certain kinds of positions, which then the aesthetic project could grapple onto and could take a position or not take a position, engage with it or not engage with it. I think it's actually indicative also, perhaps, of a certain conception of political history, which maybe in the 1990s had led us to a position where, and I don't want to go into like a sort of a Fukuyama sort of tailspin, but a position where we thought that like the political positions were already mapped out. We had like basically ideas about what the specific possibilities for political action are in the universe, and then we can take positions within that sort of already achieved political matrix. That's all politics is. But I think there are different, temporal conceptions, macro-historical conceptions of the political, which allow for human agency in relation to a universe which is also unpredictable. Right? So I think we need to reintroduce unpredictability on both sides of the equation. You've reintroduced it in terms of the imagination. Imagination is a capacity for human thought or human engagement with the universe, which is not predetermined by certain kinds of concepts and traditions which come down to us, which has a certain kind of potential for the unexpected. But we have to also recognize that the universe, the political universe, is unexpected as well. It can produce things which we do not predict. It can throw up problems which are then dumped into our present by a future and which demand responses. And this, I think, would be like the ultimately more productive conception both of politics and of aesthetics, or aesthetics which is open to a certain kind of creative, improvisational sort of activity in the face of a universe which is also improvising, and which is continuously dumping problems on us, which demand us to make new solutions to them. So sort of push the political side open as well, and you get to a place where you have a much more, dynamic dialectic between these two terms that we've been throwing around.
Sure. I mean, this is, as you were saying, this is a scholastic question of how you define politics. I mean, the politics that I thought I want to preserve the potential to overcome that politics is, of course, politics as it has emerged out of the 18th century. I mean, hence my example about Voltaire and Jean Calas. And there's nothing to be said about it. I mean, it has been absolutely fantastic, but it feels like, again, in the previous discussion, I was so impressed because at the horizon of our discussion, there was a desire of a different way of being together rather than society, a different way of being together, saying, no, this is not about winning the elections or going back to be more correct. This is about a completely different way of being together. Yeah? I mean, in Heideggerian terms, this would be, instead of a present at hand of a subject-object relationship, it would be a ready-to-hand relationship. You just meet there, and you walk, and you don't necessarily have a project. And in this sense, nobody can pinpoint you. If you want to include that beyond politics, in the concept of politics, I'm completely happy with that. I mean, this is just, when you discuss, you have to say, okay, we use it one way or the other way. The point would be to keep open or to even use aesthetic experience or the aesthetic possibility in the sense of being able to go beyond, at least to make it imaginable, that we could live together in a way that is different from the way that the 18th century has imagined, and which is perhaps a way whose possibilities we have maxed out at this point.
I can agree with your statement, but I have one position of your conception. The imagination is central point in your conception, yes, yeah. But we can say other way, that imagination can use reaction in your fight against progress and revolutionary ideas. For example, mystics of Ignatius Loyola, Catholic Church, very effectively used against Reformation, and we know about counter-Reformation ideas, and conservative utopia of Solzhenitsyn against the West and progress and Western society, and many other examples. What can you say about this?
Well, I will just respond with another example from Spanish mysticism. Yeah? I mean, Ignacio de Loyola would be the typical case of somebody, endowed with an enormous imagination, who uses this imagination constantly within a political system in order to control, to make everything predictable. Nothing is more predictable than a day in the life of a Jesuit. It's absolutely predictable, and it's absolutely functional, and it serves the church. Now, I name my favorite mystic, who happens to be a woman. That's Teresa de Avila. Yeah, Teresa de Avila, if you read her autobiography, which she had no right to declare an autobiography because a woman had no right in the 17th century to write an autobiography. This is why officially it was a confession. She, for example, talks about the possibility to physically feel the pain that somebody who is sick has, and to redeem the other person from your pain. You said, okay, that is medically impossible. But this way of living together, where feeling the pain is not only a compassion, but you can physically suffer from the pain somebody else has. You can take that pain away. You can imagine a community of nuns. I mean, this sounds very Catholic, but a community of nuns that lives together, also in an erotic way. So there's a potential, for example, there in mysticism historically that got reduced because it got squeezed into political coordinates. Yeah? For example, a rereading of the visions of Teresa de Avila that would emphasize the side of imagination, the potential of imagination there, could have, if we use the broader concept of politics, a political effect that Ignacio de Loyola could never have. So in that sense, with the Spanish mysticism, you gave me a nice contrast, and I would go the Teresa de Avila route, because this would be precisely to set free the potential of imagination.
One comment, first of all, I think that when Benjamin speaks about politicizing the aesthetics, I think this is no longer taken very seriously, and the examples from Russia that we saw, this poetry, I think this is mostly taken as a political action, a political statement in a direct sense of the word, more than poetry. That is, would really be a subject of literary criticism in this sense. But the other thing is that, just following up on what Kevin said, I think that this community, or the broadening of matrices, and I think the political potential of the imagination, the borders of this should be broadened to include also different temporal and spatial realities, in the sense that James Joyce can become political in the Soviet Union of the 60s, right? Or reading Lolita in Tehran can become political in ways that obviously Nabokov never intended, but that's a high price to pay. That is, that's not in the here and now, that's in many years, or in a different reality. That's just a comment.
See, this is, let me comment, I mean, these are rather comments than questions and answers, but let me comment with this example of my student Yura. Yeah, I mean, to say that collective lesbian suicide is subversive, that's old hat. Yeah, and I think this is precisely, I mean, you know, in that sense, castrating, I mean, and the pun intended, not pun intended, but paradox intended. I mean, whereas what she's doing in her honors thesis, trying to let her own imagination be inspired by these cases, and what it could be to end a relationship of ecstatic love in death together. Yeah? I mean, that gets you to a situation, to an imagination that I think is productive, that is moving. I have to say, each time that I read the new pages, and every week I want to read these pages, I'm moved by what she's writing. Whereas if I say, oh, this is subversion, you know, you can just check it. And I mean, so precisely this was in a way maybe too much within my own profession. This was against what literary critics are doing, who are constantly obliged to politicize everything. And you know, the temptation would be to transform James Joyce into a social democrat deputy. Yeah? And I mean, this is precisely a role in which James Joyce is not very powerful. Whereas if you let, for example, Molly's monologue, especially of man, if you read that, and if you let your imagination go, it can lead you somewhere unpredictable that is interesting. And this was an argument in favor of that possibility and against us literary critics undercutting that possibility, because we constantly, following Benjamin's recipe, feel that we have to politicize imagination.
I wanted to go back to the autonomy of the aesthetic and think maybe about the autonomy of the aesthetic from the ethical, not only from the political, which is of course a linked thing. And thinking in terms of, for example, bioart today, in the age of biotechnologies and a constant human nature being in flux and unclear exactly where it's going to end and when it's going to go, right? And the whole concept of the anthropos, where the ethical has become open. We don't quite share a grounded in nature ethics anymore, and it's going to be changing. So bioartists in the US in particular have been experimenting with the concept of bioaesthetics rather than bioethics, precisely to question the political and the ethical norms upon which our civilization has been based within the realm of these biotechnologies. So I'm just seconding your point, but I think in this realm of changing nature and changing ethics, the ethics being kind of work in progress to some extent,
Okay.
The aesthetical becomes very interesting.
I mean, I normally have seen that. I mean, I have avoided the concept of ethics as much as I normally avoid the name of my doctoral advisor for very different reasons. I mean, it's almost a condamnatio memoriae, because I feel when we say ethical, especially in academia, we always pretend we have a recipe and have to tell people how to lead their lives. Yeah? Whereas my conception of a colloquium like this, my conception of a good class, my conception of what the university as an institution could be, would be precisely a place where you are not pressed to constantly articulate where you have to go, what you want to have achieved. I mean, this is why I like your, I mean, if you say, okay, ethics is an experimental space where we can see where we go, but not where we think about strategies to realize what we already know, then I'm completely with you. Yeah? I mean, to give you an example, we do every Thursday evening at my university a philosophical reading group. It starts at 6:30 and it can go till midnight. And we discuss very intensely a philosophical text and we see what happens. Yeah? I don't count that. I mean, this is not teaching a text. You see what happens, like a discussion here. I mean, I think today there were several moments when this discussion became unbelievably productive. And when you felt almost like in the Bible that everybody was speaking with tongues. I mean, every contribution was somehow interesting. You couldn't fail. And you want this moment to happen, and you do not want to avoid it by constantly asking yourself pragmatic questions. So if we understand that by...
You probably thought I'm talking about bioethics. No, I said the ethical is suspended. And bioaesthetics is the space of experimentation. Okay. Bioaesthetics.
No, then
this is exactly what you're talking
about. Look, I mean, then I like it even more. It's almost too much for somebody from Berkeley and Stanford, right? We are no longer productive if we agree too much.
I really can't agree more with everything you said. Yeah, it's like, I don't know, like a lecture to me to hear everything you said. But my suggestion is whether I'm not going to go into the politics versus aesthetics experience, because I think what you said about imagination and conceptualization is somewhat, takes it. It's more general.
No, that's the key point, yeah.
Yeah, and in general, but is not any sort of conceptualization a way to preserve the imagination, which otherwise is going to cool down?
Yes.
I take the imaginative thing, I can conceptualize it, and which invites somebody else to reconceptualize it according to his or her personal experience. So isn't it somehow implicit, the necessity to reduce, in a way, in an irreducible power of imagination?
No, absolutely. I mean, this is, let me phrase it, I mean, how I would phrase it theoretically, and I go pretty much along Wolfgang Iser, his theory of imagination. I mean, a text like, as it has been mentioned, Ulysses or Finnegan's Wake, of course, is a text that has words and has concepts, therefore. I mean, even in Joyce, most of the words you can find in a lexicon, so there are concepts. But if you use that text under conditions of fiction, under conditions of aesthetic autonomy, then those concepts of the text can trigger your imagination, and that's a situation different from a situation where you're obliged to figure out exactly the same concepts that the author has. But of course, for that to function, for texts like the text you were dealing with, to be able to trigger imagination, or Santa Teresa de Avila, over a span of 400 years, they have to be preserved in concepts. But the concepts of a text that is being read under fictional condition are concepts that trigger imagination instead of being concepts to be deciphered. Yeah? And this is why, as you know, I also have a certain resistance against the hermeneutic tradition. Whereas, what does the text mean? No, it is precisely not what does the text mean, but what is the potential of the text to trigger your imagination in ways that are unforeseeable. And I think that's a nice way to finish.
Thank you so much. Thank you.